Okay, we're going to get started. Everybody's okay? Good evening, and welcome to the annual Oweida Lecture in Journalism Ethics. I'm Walter Middlebrook, the Foster Professor of Practice in the Belisario College of Communications. The college is pleased to host this annual event that brings leading figures from journalism and academia to campus to discuss news ethics. The Oweida Lecture fits beautifully within the College of Communications' overarching curricula, programs, and research emphasis on ethics in mass communication. In other words, striving always to do the right thing. Our college puts a premium on teaching ethics. We want our students to understand that being a great journalist requires more than being a dogged reporter or broadcaster, a compelling writer, the fastest tweeter, or a great videographer. Journalists have a moral responsibility to be honest, accurate, and free of bias, to sources, to consumers of news, and to society as a whole. 2 decades ago, Peg Oweida endowed this lecture in memory of her husband, Dr. Nick Oweida, who came to the United States from Lebanon in 1950. He set up what would become a successful medical practice in New Kensington, Pennsylvania. Dr. Oweida built an outstanding reputation and was elected president of the medical staff of a local hospital, only to have that reputation tarnished when a newspaper recklessly suggested that he had not shown good judgment, had performed unnecessary surgeries, and had made incorrect diagnoses. Dr. Oweida sued to restore his reputation and was successful. Peg Oweida decided to establish this lecture series so that the Penn State community could learn more about the importance of ethics. Media outlets today employ some of the best educated, most conscientious journalists in history, and they are dedicated to holding introspective conversations about how the news should be reported in an ethical manner. Tonight's speaker comes through the ranks of one of America's great news-gathering institutions. Our speaker, Paula Froke, is editor of the Associated Press Stylebook and manager with AP's standards team. She started her 40-year career with the AP the summer after her sophomore year at Penn State as a Dow Jones News Fund intern on the AP's main editing desk in New York City. Her career has included jobs as news editor in Minnesota and Michigan, deputy national editor at headquarters in New York, assistant managing editor on the AP's Nerve Center, AP embedded editor at MSN News, and executive director of the Associated Press Media Editors. Among her many adventures, she was part of AP's editing crew at the Atlanta, Nagano, Sydney, and Vancouver Olympics. A State College native, she is a competitive cycler and at the Masters national level and rides gravel bikes. Her topic tonight is depicting the world accurately and therefore ethically through the words that we use and the people that we include. After remarks, we hope you'll stick around for a Q&A session we'll try to get everybody involved and get all your questions in. And with that note, let's give a round resounding we are to this evening's speaker, Paula Froke.
Hello, everyone. So I was struggling to figure out how to begin tonight, and here was one idea that I came up with. I'm delighted to speak here in Happy Valley at one of the most renowned party schools in the country. Well, maybe not. How about I'm delighted to speak here at Penn State, the collegiate wrestling dynasty of the US. Or maybe it's a pleasure to speak here at this Cow College, which is a term that is used in varying degrees of great respect for Penn State and its agriculture tradition and disparagingly by some. Or maybe it's nice to be here at the home of Fawn, home of the great fundraiser for kids with cancer. Finally, I decided on, I'm honored to be talking with you here at the Belisario College of Communications, one of the most respected collegiate communications programs in the country. Okay, now it's your turn. Think back on each of my proposed openings, the words I used as shorthand descriptions to describe the Pennsylvania State University. Think of how you felt, the images in your head, when I use each of those terms. Think of how others might perceive Penn State when it's described through each of those shorthand phrases. Words matter a lot. The words, even a single word, that we use to describe a person or convey a scene, shape the thoughts and perceptions of readers and listeners. That means that the words and language that we use in our stories are fundamental to ethics in journalism. The language we use is at the core of each and every story that you write. It's central to depicting the world accurately and therefore ethically. Let me pause to say this. I'm talking specifically tonight about words, but these concepts apply to visual journalism as well. Okay, so if you're a visual journalist primarily, view these concepts through the lens of visuals, through the images that you choose to make, the images that you choose not to make, those that you don't even think about, the framing that you use. All of this has parallels in the visual world as well, but I'm focusing specifically on words. So, as one example, consider the phrase immigration sweep, a term that we hear often in the news. We had used it a lot in AP stories, and I had never given it a second thought. Then an AP colleague pointed out that the term immigration sweep could make it sound as if something dirty or someone dirty needed to be cleaned up. It took his perspective and background to help me think of that phrase in a new way, and to question whether there wasn't a better, more accurate, more neutral, less potentially harmful way of conveying the situation. Getting that kind of feedback from a colleague was essential, and that kind of collaboration is something that I'll talk more about in a bit. So some other examples of how the words we use can alter people's impressions. Do you describe these people or people around their age as elderly, or maybe as grandparents in a shorthand kind of way, or as champion athletes? What about me, if you're describing me? Am I a frazzled editor on election night? Okay, for those of you who don't know, pizza is an election night standard, even if you're working at home during COVID. And that might be alcohol in the back, but I wasn't using it that night. At any rate, am I a frazzled editor? Am I a Masters National track cyclist? Or maybe you might describe me as a cancer patient, or maybe a cancer victim, or maybe a cancer survivor. You might choose to use all of those terms at the same time, since they all happen more or less simultaneously. Good time. But if you're a journalist falling into the trap of summing up someone in a few words, which version do you use? And don't think that you don't do it. We all do it. We all fall into this. I need some concise version in a headline or a lead. I'm going to come up with a way to convey this person very quickly. There's any number of versions of a person or a scene or an event that you can use. We all fall into the trap of trying to sum it up in a couple of words. But stop and think, how do those words affect how the audience perceives the people or the person or the people that you're conveying, or the event? Especially, as is often the case, if they don't read past the headline or the first paragraph or the second paragraph. So those concise words that you use are the only version of the event or the person that they get. Words matter. In the worst cases, some journalists, not any of us, might choose words specifically with the intent of influencing or biasing readers and listeners. More innocently, whether on purpose or not, writers often string together words into vague terms that obscure and conceal. Think about the term officer-involved shooting, or collateral damage, or negative budget implications. This concealing or obscuring can happen easily, even with the best of intentions. Sometimes it results from sloppiness, such as using imprecise or incomplete shorthand. Sometimes it results from implicit bias, and that's a concept that I'll talk about in a bit. Or maybe it's simply an innocent lack of understanding about how some terms can be interpreted depending on a person's background and experiences in life. And that last point is very important, and it's something that most of us don't necessarily stop and think about. How you perceive words or a description isn't necessarily the way your neighbor perceives it or this reader perceives it. Everyone has differing experiences, and the words can have a powerful effect on how something is perceived. For instance, the phrase unarmed black man, all right? That was a phrase that has been in the news quite a bit in the past several years. It became adopted as a kind of easy shorthand with the best of intentions aimed at conveying the idea that the man wasn't carrying a gun, was black, and was shot for no apparent reason other than that he was black, okay? Again, adopted with the best of intentions, I think, to convey a sense of outrage at this situation. But think about it again. Would you ever use the term unarmed white man? Certainly unarmed man, but the term unarmed white man just doesn't come up. So several of my black colleagues in the AP pointed out, and then we heard from some readers as well, that the term unarmed black man can convey the idea or the impression that the default is for all black men to be armed, to be carrying guns. Otherwise, why would it be necessary to point out that this particular one wasn't armed? It's a balance, right? I mean, because you are trying to convey the situation, but it's another example of how something even done with the best of intentions can be heard and read entirely differently. In general, in situations like that, we advise using more words. Okay, journalists are always told to be concise, but we say be specific and don't try and condense most things into a couple of words. Okay, so let's talk about how this relates to my work with the AP Stylebook, and you are among the first to see our new cover for the 2024-26 print edition. Some background on the Stylebook. As you know, AP is a not-for-profit news cooperative that covers news around the globe. In 1953, the AP produced the first version of the Stylebook. It was about 60 pages, and it was in the day of teletype, which most of you probably don't even know what that is. But that was the way of transmitting news, and the goal at that time was largely typographical consistency. It was very important, it was a huge undertaking, but the goal is typographical consistency. By 1978, I hate to confess this, when I started at Penn State, the Stylebook had expanded significantly. We had even more coverage of matters of mechanics, such as punctuation, grammar, spelling, numbers. But it also evolved into a sort of mini encyclopedia with a lot of facts and figures on topics that journalists typically covered. But they were facts and figures. How many countries, for instance, are in the African Union? Now, to take you back in time, it was a very different world then. We used typewriters, manual typewriters, not even electric typewriters, when I started at Penn State my first year and at the Collegian to write our stories. Fortunately, computers eventually came along, and I will tell you, for those of you who know Mike Portman, this is in here only because Mike wanted a photo of me at the Collegian, and then he didn't even come. But we did eventually get computers. But again, back to those days, what many now call mainstream media was really the only news media at that time. And a principle that guided us was our role as gatekeepers. Basically, this was the view that journalists had the job of filtering out all the extraneous, irrelevant, biased, and simply wrong chatter in the world, and delivering just the facts, deciding what stories were important enough to report on, and what stories should simply be ignored. This approach had both pros and cons, especially when viewed through today's lens. That can be a subject of an entire different lecture, but it was an entirely different time. Obviously, the growth first of cable media and then the internet changed all of that. Most of you have grown up in a time when anyone can be a journalist, and when many people get their news from the totally unfiltered social media. Gatekeeping these days can mean that any organization with a particular point of view filters out anything that doesn't agree with that view in presenting the news. And as news consumers, we act as our own gatekeepers by ignoring sources we don't agree with. So at the AP, we know that our core values of accuracy and fairness and our longstanding efforts to help set the standard for ethics in journalism are more important than ever. In part, we convey those standards and ethics through the AP Stylebook, especially with our increasing emphasis on careful consideration of words and language, and on the importance of inclusivity and diversity for accurate and ethical journalism. The Stylebook these days covers not just style, spelling, grammar, punctuation, but also some broader guidelines and discussions. That's a key point there, discussions about language involved in a number of key topics in the news. Those include race, gender, disabilities, immigration, climate change, and much more. So some of this takes what I call a discussionary approach, noting key points to consider and discuss, but also noting that there are a lot of gray areas. There's not always an absolute right or wrong. We discuss some of those points in the book itself, but very importantly, we also stress the need to discuss these points with yourself, with your colleagues, with others not involved, with any of a number of other people, each time you're dealing with any of these questions, and also before you're dealing with any of those questions, and I'll get to that again in a little bit. So a key concept throughout this expanded guidance, again, is the importance of language and the words we use, and how readers and listeners perceive the stories that we're conveying. Professor Andy Bechtel of the University of North Carolina puts it this way: the AP Stylebook helps my students write and edit with the sense and sensitivity expected of the next generation of communicators. Sense and sensitivity. That means, again, describing the world accurately and therefore ethically through the words that we use and the people that we include. So, some more examples. In 2019, the Stylebook added an umbrella entry called race-related coverage. Our introduction to that guidance says, reporting and writing about issues involving race calls for thoughtful consideration, precise language, and discussions with others of diverse backgrounds, whenever possible, about how to frame coverage or what language is most important, accurate, and fair. We also say, and this is very important to note a person's race in a story only when it's relevant to the story and when that relevant is explicit in the story. And that's a point that we come back to again and again, relevance, okay? We talk about that in gender, disabilities, and many other areas, immigration status, and many other areas. So we have many points of guidance covering a lot of areas in the race-related coverage entry. One of them was one of the first things we did when we started expanding this, which gets to the point of when to call an action, a particular action, racist, as opposed to racially tinged, racially motivated, racially biased, etc. Up until really 2019, 2020, for whatever reason, it seemed many in the media, most in the media, shied away from using the term racist for an action, even when it clearly was racist. There was no hesitation to use terms such as sexist or ageist, but there was a definite lack of willingness to use the term racist even for actions that were clearly racist, that meet the definition of racism. So we explored that issue in our new guidance, again, talking about the need to have careful discussions, being specific about the words and actions, and noting that describing a particular action as racist need not and should not get to the person's motivations. And we also say we do not use the term racist to describe a person because we can't get to what's in their head, their motivations. You can talk about actions more specifically as possibly racist, but that's just one example of some of what that guidance does. Another that I'd like to highlight just came up recently and will be in the new book. It seems perhaps a small point, a matter of mechanics, but it is a matter of great importance to some people. And this came up when we were updating our guidance on Native Americans and Indigenous people. We talked with Native American members of the AP staff and with leaders of the Indigenous Journalists Association. And they pointed out this, all right? People often use possessive constructions in an informal way, such as Penn State storms, Pennsylvania's forests, State College's restaurants, and that's just fine, that's okay. But for Native Americans, that language of possession in some uses takes on a much more personal and much more offensive tone. For instance, the phrase, Oklahoma's Native American tribes, or South Dakota's Pine Ridge Reservation, can very much make it sound like the tribes belong to Oklahoma or the reservation belongs to South Dakota. Now again, that's not something that would have ever occurred to me, but that is something that rings loud and clear in the ears of our Native American staff and members of their tribe, members and citizens of their tribe. And obviously that is contrary to the history and status of Native American people. So it's another example of trying to get beyond how we, each of us, innocently perceive points of language and really dive more deeply into how others might hear it. It's impossible to anticipate every situation, but raising your awareness of some of these situations and expanding your conversations can go a long way. I need to keep looking at these. Oops. Okay. So it's up to us as ethical journalists to understand that and to incorporate that understanding in our work. Some other examples, gender. We have a lot of guidance that evolves rapidly because terminology in gender-related coverage is evolving rapidly, and part of what we do is try and keep up with that. The term queer is one example. The Stylebook notes that many LGBTQ+ people now use the word queer as a point of empowerment to refer to sexual orientation or gender identity, but because of its origins as a slur, many people still object to that use. It's not universally accepted among LGBTQ+ people, and its use tends to be more prevalent among younger generations. Now, you all, most of you being of the younger generation ilk, might not think twice of it, but this is another cautionary to recognize that words are interpreted very differently depending on a person's background, age, and any of a number of other things. And so we don't say use it, don't use it. We say use caution, think about this, depending on your audience and the situation. A couple of years ago, we also did a major set of updates or additions on disabilities. And a lot of that got into the question of person-first language or identity-first language. I could go on for another couple hours about that, but in the interest of time, I won't. We could do it in the Q&A if you want to. But an example among any elsewhere in the disabilities entry, we say avoid using disability-related words lightly or in unrelated situations, and avoid direct quotations using such wording unless it's essential to the story. Some examples include calling a person or an idea demented, psychotic, lame, blind, catatonic, moronic, retarded, on the spectrum, a term that in particular I think is tossed about a lot. Or saying the warning falls on deaf ears, he turned a blind eye, I still have PTSD about that final. Okay, we say these things innocently, we don't think about the meaning, but for those who have each of those conditions, they can be very offensive to kind of throw it out there as meaningless, as a neutral term. Again, words matter. We have similar guidance in our immigration and migration entry, which says to avoid imagery conjuring war or natural disasters such as onslaught, tidal wave, flood, inundation, invasion, army, march, sneak, and stealth, all of which show up with some regularity in immigration and migration coverage. Instead, we say use numbers and facts, which is again a point that we come to again and again in the Stylebook. Be specific, don't use generalities, don't use labels, use the specifics. For example, it's the largest number of unaccompanied children encountered at the border on record. And then back to the words survivor and victim as another example. Survivor, as a term, can denote someone who has lived through an injury or disease altogether, but it also can apply to someone who endured a threat but escaped injury, such as a mass shooting survivor. What does that mean? The term victim can create confusion because it can variously mean somebody killed, somebody injured, somebody subjected to mistreatment, such as sexual misconduct. So again, we say be specific and spell out what you mean in each case. Okay, another example, cliches and jargon. You've probably been told, I hope you've been told, to avoid cliches and jargon in your writing, probably because it's bad writing, lazy writing, which it is. But what's the relevance to ethical journalism? Again, it's a matter of specificity and detail, and therefore accuracy and ethics. Say what you mean. Don't cloud it with cliches and jargon. We had fun, if you can call it fun, it was kind of fun, of making up several extreme examples of cliches and jargon to avoid. This here is what not to do. Do not take this as what to do. But it also is what journalists do, not to this extreme, but in varying degrees, quite a lot. Get it? Begonia jargon, that was part of that. We have, also in the book, we have, well, I put it online because it was taking up too much space in the print book, but we have examples from community government, from policing, from politics. This, again, is extreme, but we all falling into the trap, speaking of another cliche, of defaulting to this kind of language, which very often can turn off readers, among other things, which means they don't read your stories, which in itself is a sort of ethical problem if you're turning them away from the stories that you're trying to convey, but it also obscures the meaning. So again, an ethical journalist is, among other things, one who writes clearly and specifically. Back to shorthand descriptions, I talked earlier about that. Often journalists use them because they're convenient and concise. But again, when describing a person or an event or an action, using shorthand can be the opposite of fair and accurate. Again, use more words. Something that we really hate is the terminology, okay? The poor, the homeless, the wealthy, the disabled, the beautiful, the college-educated, which has a number of issues. For one, it removes all humanity from these people, the wealthy, the disabled. It sounds as if they're a rock, not people. And it also implies that all of these people, all of these groups are monolithic, which they're not. These can be dehumanizing and cloud and distort meaning. All right, let's take a moment to make this more personal. Think about some words or phrases that others might use or that others have used to convey a key trait about you or your family. Maybe someone says you were given up for adoption, or refers to your adoptive parents instead of your parents. Maybe someone driving drunk ran a stop sign and severely injured your dad, and somebody calls that an accident. Maybe your parents came to the US from Mexico and were called illegal aliens. Maybe others call you, or you call yourself, an addict or a drunk. Or your sister has schizophrenia, and you have to listen to people talking about insane class schedules or a schizo professor. Really, stop and think about that, or when you leave here, think about that as it applies to your own life. Consider how some of those terms make you feel, how they make you feel about yourself, and how they make you feel about others who use those terms. And then consider how to apply that sense and sensitivity to your own work as journalists and professional communicators. So again, the language we use, whether in news stories or everyday conversations, is central to how others view us. It can be a big factor in how we view ourselves. It's central to how readers and listeners think about our story subjects. And it's central to writing in a way that's ethical and accurate. That was part one. Time to step back a little bit. Before we decide what language to use, before we get to this point, we need to decide what people to include in our news coverage to begin with. Often, of course, it's not a matter of choice. News happens, it's news, we cover it. But at least as often, we do have choices in who and what we do and don't cover. We have choices about who to interview, what topics are important, and what photos and video to shoot. A terrific resource, and if you haven't encountered this, I really encourage you to look it up, to help consider these points, besides, of course, the AP Stylebook, is what's called the Trust in News Project. It's a joint venture of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism and Oxford University. And they've done a lot of research on why so many people don't trust the news, and they explore ways that we as journalists might change that. And while their focus is on trust in news, a lot of what they have found in talking to subjects of news is equally applicable, I think, to ethics in journalism. They did several studies, one that I particularly was interested in late 2022 and early 2023. They talked with 322 people in 41 focus groups in 4 countries. And they got some really interesting in-depth individual comments from a lot of these people about how they feel about how they and their colleagues and their friends are portrayed in the news media. I just want to read you a couple comments from this study. Researchers said of these people that they interviewed, most saw news media as not only out of touch, but at times an especially harmful force that did real damage to their communities, either through neglecting them altogether, or exploiting them, reinforcing harmful stereotypes, or sensationalizing in divisive and polarizing ways. They also said the news media as an institution was also often viewed by these folks as an extension of systems aligned to serve those in power, systems many felt excluded from. And those findings echoed what has been found in a lot of other studies. It was just a much more personal take on it, I thought, and really a fascinating read. But they found that in most of journalism, we fail again and again to report on and present the world and the people in their entirety and their complexity. At the AP, our news leaders have had similar concerns for a number of years and have been taking steps to address that. A very effective move was around 4 years ago, the executive editor convened what we call inclusion champions on the staff. They're a group of staff from around the globe who take the lead role in working with colleagues on more inclusive and thus more ethical coverage and editing. They did a lot of internal training. We have a lot of great Slack channels in which we, in real time, discuss some of these issues. And they have a lot of written material on things like implicit biases and a number of other points that I'll get to. But it was really great material, and I looked at it and I thought, this is fabulous, but it's internal to the AP, and it really needs to get broader distribution and publication. So in 2022, I compiled much of what the Inclusion Champions had written and edited it into a new style book chapter called Inclusive Storytelling. Here's how that chapter begins, and again, this is the words of the Inclusion Champions themselves. Inclusive storytelling seeks to truly represent all people around the globe. It gives voice and visibility to those who have been missing or misrepresented in the traditional narratives of both history and daily journalism. It helps readers and viewers both to recognize themselves in stories and to better understand people who differ from them in race, age, gender, class, and many other ways. It makes our work immeasurably stronger, more relevant, more compelling, more trustworthy. It is essential to accuracy and fairness. It's not a topic to be siloed or explored here and there. Inclusive storytelling should be part of everyday conversations, decision-making, and coverage. That means integrating these goals into all aspects of conversations, from the beginning of a story idea, throughout the story process, to garnering reaction and more story ideas after the story is published. They go on to say, being an inclusive storyteller calls on all of us to stretch beyond our accustomed ways of thinking, our usual sources, our regular go-to topics, or angles for coverage. It challenges us to recognize and overcome our unconscious biases. It aims to infuse every aspect of coverage, both in text and in visuals, with diverse voices and faces, perspectives, and contexts. It is considerate of language, sources, and diverse audiences. It often, again, relies on teamwork and collaboration. Among the considerations, the stories we choose to convey, the sources we talk with, the images we select, the framing, approach, and specific words that we use, the details that we include or don't include, and the understanding, again, that all of these various parts of a story can be seen and interpreted very differently, depending on a person's background and experiences. So what does that mean in practice? Great, sounds good, we can all agree with it. How do you go about making this happen? Again, thanks to the Inclusion Champions work, the chapter goes into some specifics, some broad concepts that we address. We say, to start with, there's two distinct and equally important paths. Okay, one, cast a wide net when looking for voices and images on any story, whether it's on education or health, politics, marathon running, architecture, whatever your beat is, go beyond your usual sources and look for people who haven't typically been included in your stories. You know, if a story requires some kind of expert commentary, such as a political scientist or an academic focusing on a particular area, don't stick with the same people you've always talked to, even if they're at Penn State. Widen your search by going to institutions that aren't as well known, or smaller community groups instead of the biggest nonprofits. When looking for people on the street, man on the street, person on the street, general reaction to something, be conscious, be intentional of who you're reaching out to. Don't settle for people who are the quickest and easiest to interview. Make sure that you're hearing from a range of people, seek them out. So that's one, just on any story that you're doing. And then secondly, of course, home in on individual communities and voices and stories focused on that group. And I have to say, we in the AP have done a whole lot of stories that we would not have done had it not been for the efforts of the Inclusion Champions. Another key point that this chapter makes, it's not tokenism. Okay, the point is not to make a cursory effort to include a diverse voice or two in order to check a box. Instead, for both accurate and ethical journalism, we truly must develop a fuller picture of people's varied experiences and perspectives. Going back to that monolith point, we say by extension, no one group should be treated as a monolith. It should go without saying that not all people with disabilities have the same views, not all gay people have the same views, not all black people have the same views, not all Penn State students have the same views, not all Belisario College of Communication students have the same views, but too often our stories are presented in a way that implies they do. You know, you talk to one or two people and you say, this is what the gay community thinks, or this is what these, communication students think. Again, be specific. Talk to more people. Obviously you can never capture the views of every single person, but the more people that you talk to, you can get a more nuanced view of the situation, and you can get more voices into your story, more voices and images into your story. Okay, I said I'd talk about an unconscious or implicit bias. I don't know if that's a term that's familiar, I don't know if that's taught, but basically it's the idea that everyone has unconscious or implicit biases, and they are unconscious or implicit, even, again, with the best of intentions. And they influence the way we assess a person or a situation before we have the facts, and from there they can shape what facts we gather and which ones we don't, and how we interpret them, again, without our even being aware or thinking of it, unless we very specifically think about it. They can affect the words we choose again, how we cast a headline, what angle we take in photographing a person or a scene. They can include implicit assumptions that we might not even realize are biases, such as the idea, the concept somewhere in the back of your head that adults should be employed, married, have kids, be romantically active, eat meat, whatever. Again, you might not think of those as biases, but somehow you have these ideas in the back of your head that this is what adults are. This is what adults do. We say even seemingly positive assumptions grounded in stereotypes, such as Asian Americans being smart and hardworking, or Jews being wealthy and influential, are overgeneralizations, and they can distort complex realities. So, because they're implicit and unconscious, you're not always aware that you have them. But be aware that they exist. And as you're approaching a story, before you get into really dealing with it, try to explore any preconceived notions that you might have about the person or topic. And you really have to do work on this, okay? This is not an easy thing. Ask yourself how your own life experiences affect how you see this topic. And consider how that affects how you approach the story. Again, how you frame it, who you talk to, who you photograph. And then ask yourself, what steps have you taken to overcome assumptions in your reporting and storytelling once you identified them? So those are some, not all, of the kind of overarching concepts in the inclusive storytelling chapter. We also have some even more specifics on how to go about trying to bring more voices and images into your story. I'm going to put these up on the screen. The consider and collaborate is a key one, and that again goes to every stage of the storytelling, from the generating of the story ideas to the final editing. Ask whose voice or perspective is missing or should be represented more clearly. Again, consider and reflect the wide range of interests, needs, and voices of the people. And think about all of these different points. It's not just one or two. Sometimes people think of inclusive storytelling as just about race, for example, or just about gender. It encompasses a really broad array. What the writers, the Trust and News people, talked to people in a rural area, and one of them said, you know what, rural people are never in the news unless there's a natural disaster. You know, a tornado comes through and wipes out a mobile home park, and that's when we're in the news. Otherwise, we might as well not exist. So go talk to some rural people. Go talk to people in mobile homes. And I promised I was not going to go off on a tangent, as I want to do, but I can't help myself with mobile homes, okay? The phrase, the girl was kidnapped a block from her mobile home. What relevance is that? It was her home. The fact that it was a mobile home is not relevant to anything, or if it is relevant, then make that relevance clear. This is another example of how we just kind of toss these things out there without really giving it any thought. Some more on consideration and collaboration. Again, diversify the sources. Present it as important and credible. If we're not talking to these people, if we're not putting them in the story, we act as if they're not important or credible. Avoid falling into these stereotypes or relying on always heard voices. Collaborate from the outset, again, with colleagues in all formats. Colleagues in all formats, and I can't remember what's in the slides, but also, again, all departments. You know, show your story to people outside the journalism bubble, and it is, in fact, a bubble. Show your story to someone in accounting, or your neighbor who majors in art, and get their view on a topic. And do it early in the process. It's not real helpful to wait until the very end to say, okay, what do you think of my story? You really need to get people involved early and often. It's also not just for the sake of the story, but for the sake of your own self as a person and as a journalist. It expands your understanding of the experiences and perspectives of people with backgrounds other than yours. And if the editor is not editing, if the editor editing the story is not the one that you've been working with, make sure that you convey these efforts to them. I'm going to confess for a moment that I've lost track of where I am in my slides, and I don't want to jump ahead wrongly. So let's stop with the slides for a minute, and I will get back to these slides as I can. But I wanted to return to the idea of the importance of language, of avoiding implications of monoliths with any group, of being cautious about labels and shorthand descriptions, and of knowing that words can be interpreted differently depending on your background. And being ever mindful of the diversity of our world, the stories that we choose to cover, and the people that we choose to interview, and how all of that is essential to ethical journalism. All right, there is a 4-word proclamation. It's a kind of shorthand that all of us in this room know very well. Many of us, if not all of us, cherish it. It's terrific in conveying unity, pride, strength, and a degree of common experience, understanding, and appreciation that all of us share. It's a shorthand that I do love. But the next time that you use this phrase, pause for a beat and reflect on all of the uniquely individual people and experiences that are central and essential to the meaning of this shorthand. Think about the people and the words behind the shorthand. And consider what that means as you do your work as journalists. Are you ready? We are. Thank you. Now we'll go. Oh, see, I missed a whole lot of slides. Oh, there we go. That is it. Thank you. I can go back to the slides I missed. I had this horrible thought that I was going to get to the "we are" slide when I wasn't ready for it, and that would kind of blow my lame attempt at it. Okay, did you hear what I just said? I started to say lame attempt at an ending, all right? This is stuff that the thing that I have an issue with all the time, I'm forever wanting to say it's crazy, it drives me crazy, this drives me crazy. I just said lame attempt at an ending. We have to check ourselves constantly, okay? And you really, really don't want to do that in writing for publication, but even in casual conversations, don't do it. But it is an ongoing effort. I catch myself even when I know better, even when I say not to do it, and then these words come out of my mouth just because it has been a knee-jerk kind of thing for more years than we care to talk about, right? But the idea is to be wary of it and be aware of it and do what you can to be more specific and use other words because they can be highly, highly offensive.
Get yourself, take a break.
Okay.
Can we get Paula a break? Thank you. So we're going to do a quick Q&A right quick. I'm going to go over there, and in the process of doing this, if you guys got any questions, get ready, because I want you to deal with the word nerd. Testing, okay. You got this little red button there.
Hello?
Yeah, all right, you're on.
All right.
So, y'all don't know this, but just to put this in perspective, Ms. Froke and I go back many years when I was an editor in Minnesota. And she was with AP, and I was a night editor in Minnesota, and I used to call her every night to find out where the story is and how do I get this information, and she was doing the same thing for me. So we're going to bring a lot of old news and new news in this. But Paul, my question to get this started is, if I'm one of these students, what was the most important thing you wanted us to get out of this? Did you want them to get out of this tonight?
Well, I can't narrow it down to one thing, there are two.
Okay.
One is that words matter, and that you encounter this in maybe not every sentence that you write, but many sentences that you write in a story, and you really need to be vigilant and paying attention to it, because it's so easy to slip into the trap of shorthand or cliches. I think shorthand is the biggest concern, because journalists in particular are trying to use shorthand for everything. I was at an editing conference last week, this session was run by someone else, and the idea of shorthand and conciseness came up, and a member of the audience said, but I thought we were supposed to be concise. You know, we need to be short. The response, both by the person who was leading that seminar and by me, is, yeah, there's times for conciseness and brevity, and there's times not to. You know, the time to limit the words you use is when you're trying to write these flowery, verbose, word picture type crap that just takes up a lot of words and doesn't actually say anything. Be concise there, cut it down to the minimum. When you're talking about a person or event, use as many words as is really necessary to accurately depict that person. And then secondly, inclusivity, because it is not just, again, not tokenism. We really cannot depict the world accurately if we're not inclusive of a wide variety of voices and images. It simply is not accurate. I mean, it goes without saying. If I'm only talking to Penn State students, it does maybe show a selection of opinions at Penn State, but it doesn't show the world at large.
You work for AP. AP has a thing called the standards team. What the hell is that?
So the standards team looks at, it's kind of the overseer of standards and ethics in the AP. And we consider a real wide variety of issues. Most recently, we've been highly involved, and I don't want to get too much into this, but the role of AI, especially generative AI in journalism coverage. We get involved in images, especially images of violence from wars or mass shootings or whatever, and what should be conveyed, what should be used, what caveats we need. We get involved in language and framing. We get involved in sources, you know, so-and-so, anonymous sources, or so-and-so is making a dramatic revelation, and at what point is it good enough to go with? We have, because news organizations are struggling, or not as well off as they used to be, AP and a lot of other places are taking funding from donors and from nonprofits who help fund some of our work. Our health and science team has some funding from various sources. We have disclaimers at the bottom saying that so-and-so helps fund this staff position but is not involved in the coverage. Part of what the standards team does, as another example, is vet these sources and say, okay, this one has a good reputation, is unbiased, meets our AP standards. We feel okay about taking some grant funding from them. This one over here, not so much. They have a clear point of view. We are not going to take any kind of money or support from them for a staff position. So it's like all over the board. You never know what's going to come up. AP Stylebook is part of that, but it's one part of many.
But you don't do this in a transparent way for the public to know what you guys are doing. How do you? Give us an example of one of your most recent standards you to come up with, and how the
Walter, honestly, things go into my head and then they go out again, and I've been so busy. But one of it has been on AI. We have spent a lot of time talking about how AI might play, generative AI in particular might or really might not, will not play a role in AP work, and how to convey those standards. I'll say that AP so far, and I would totally expect this to continue, is much, much more conservative than some, especially smaller organizations, even along the lines of beta testing a headline, or A/B testing a headline, or getting story ideas. We really do not want to use any generative AI in anything for publication, and obviously particularly not any manipulated images. We even, to the question of this, okay, here's one that came up recently. I think one of the tech writers wanted to write a story about a generative AI manipulator, created photo, right? And he proposed saying, that was in fact the topic of the story, was this particular photo that was created by generative AI, not by AP. And so he wanted to use the photo with big disclaimer saying this was created by generative AI and it's not a real photo. We had long discussions about whether we even wanted to put that on, as we say, the wire, even with disclaimers, because we are so averse to that kind of manipulating either words or photos, and we didn't want to look like in any way, even when using it to illustrate the story that it was about, to go that way.
You mentioned earlier your challenges with labeling people, and I know that a lot of newspapers gone through a process over the last couple of years, and actually when a person is a liar, we call them a liar or racist and that kind of thing. What was the process, or where does AP stand on those kinds of issues? Just brief.
We are careful, and I alluded to this, or said it briefly in talking about we don't call a person a racist. generally speaking, you can't get inside a person's head. You know, a person might say or do something that might be construed as a falsehood or construed as something racist. But the term lie in particular has a very specific motivational sound to it. Sometimes people might create a falsehood just because they don't know better. It might be innocent, sometimes not, but we don't know in most cases when we can't judge, we can't be in their heads. So generally speaking, we stay away from terms such as lying or calling a person racist, although as I said, we can more easily call the actual definable action a racist. But that's something, it's one of those very nuanced topics. It's one that comes up in our standards discussions. There might be some examples where a particular example is so extreme that it's hard to think that it's anything other than a conscious lie. There certainly have been times in AP stories I think that we use the term, but we use it with a great deal of caution.
John?
Paula, you often told us to avoid cliches like the plague, but I actually want to go back to the conciseness piece for a second. And since we have a lot of students who are in our basic news writing course and are trying their first features, if you can talk a little bit more about how specificity can work to their advantage and just staying away from overwrought leads. I specifically want to ask you to maybe point out the file that we used to have at AP called "It Was a Sunny Day."
Okay, that was my file, or maybe other people had it too?
Well, we passed it around.
Okay, I actually call it the pristine vistas lead. And this was, for some reason, no matter the topic, did not matter. Writers wanted to start out with the first graph, 2, 3, 4, 5. Even the first graph describing the weather that day. You know, it was a beautiful day, the sun was just coming up over Happy Valley, and the birds were chirping, and this and that and the other thing, and off in the distance, cows were mooing, and then 5 doors down, 5 people were killed. I mean, not that extreme, but things like this. I mean, invariably, you cut off the first 3 graphs, and the story would start there. And why is that? You know, I do not know. And I would say to people, nicely, why are you talking about the weather when the point is this? And there was never a really good answer. But it does get to the point of anecdotal leads versus straight news leads, even sometimes a one-word lead versus a one-sentence lead versus 2 or 3. We certainly don't have any hard and fast rules on that, hard and fast being a cliche that I should not use. But look at it through the eyes of a reader, right? I mean, the thing about those pristine vistas leads is you've seen one pristine vista, you've seen them all. So all of these stories, you can have 10 stories on 10 very different topics, and they all start with some version of what the day was like or the geography. Readers don't read it, right? These are very, very busy readers. So you really need to make best use of every single word that you put in the story. You want to grab the readers, suck them in, and have them keep reading. You don't want them to look at this and say, oh my God, I've read this 1,000 times, I don't care what the weather is, right? And that goes to conciseness, it goes to, I think we've talked about, we have it here, but you might have heard, each word is a gem, right? And so preserve them. Or back in the day, a phrase was "kill your babies." I'm kind of not wanting to use that now, but that used to be a term. Everyone cherishes every single word and paragraph in their story, and I think we were told back in the days in journal school, "Kill your babies." Stop treating every one of them as irreplaceable. Really make every word matter.
First of all, that was very interesting, subtle, but really powerful and important stuff, and thank you for that. My question is ethics related, but more to the fluidity of language, which I was thinking about as we were talking. I think most people just wandering around think about language as just stable, steady, it doesn't change, but in your DNA that it changes all of the time. And there are gatekeepers of that change. Culture drives change, but an institution, if you will, like the OED, know, is, okay, here, this year, this is what defines a legitimate word and what doesn't. I remember, just as an aside, when they accepted ginormous as a word, I saw that as the beginning of the end times. But along with the OED, the AP Stylebook, which at least in my world we used to refer to as the Bible, plays a powerful role in legitimizing and delegitimizing the language, certain of those gem words. And I'm just wondering if you and your colleagues who are responsible for making those decisions are sort of aware of that and conscious of that, you know, it's not immediate, that in 10, 20 years, certain words are no longer in use and others are. And you played quite possibly a very important role in making these really fundamental and important changes.
Yeah, we're very aware of that, and we take great pride in how sensitive we are to that because it is an extremely important role. We're also not a dictionary, so we are moving this year to Merriam-Webster as our new dictionary. Merriam-Webster is much more aligned with the times and evolves with language. Our previous dictionary was kind of stuck in the past. So in some cases, many cases, we default to the dictionary. We also don't want to, words come up, terms come up in the vernacular, and some of them are popular for 6 months or used for 6 months and then they disappear again. So we don't necessarily tackle every one that comes up. One example that we didn't get to for no particular reason, we just didn't deal with it, was the term woke, which I think when it first emerged a number of years ago, however long ago that was, it was used in a largely positive way. You know, somebody is woke if they're aware of issues of social justice and attuned to and care about. That was the meaning at the time. It then kind of evolved or devolved into overly woke in a kind of sarcastic way of expressing something. I believe now we have it in the style book. I think we added it last year with quotation marks and said, because of varying understandings of this term, generally avoid using it if it's in a direct quotation maybe. But yeah, that's an example of how language evolves and we have to tread very carefully on how we address it and when we address it.
Speaking of the style book, I'm pretty sure half the population in this room right now hates that book, and I guess the question is, how do you get us? How do we grab that sucker and figure out how do you learn that?
How do you not love it? Okay, first of all, it is massive, and I've added a lot to it, and frankly, the mechanics material that you probably are devoted to memorizing right now is in fact very important, and I don't want to dismiss that or lessen its importance. There's a lot of reasons that you really do need to know those mechanical points of style and spelling and our 10-page guidance on numbers. My emphasis these days is, as you might have gotten the idea, more on the substantive issues. So frankly, if it were me, I would ask that you pay special attention to our big picture topics. But I also, that's easy for me to say because I've spent the past 40 years memorizing everything else or trying to memorize it. And even that being said, I look up things multiple times per day, right? I told you that my brain just forgets everything that I did a week ago. My brain forgets what I myself wrote, you know, in the book. I'll say, what do we say about this, or what's our particular numbers guidance? So in general, and I know this is not helping you when however you're being tested or graded on this, but once you get past that, and I too was tested and graded on it back in the day, what I would really suggest is knowing what's there generally and keeping up with the updates that we do, subscribing to Stylebook Online, getting the email updates. And when you're writing about gender, when you're writing about race, when you're needing to deal with a number, you don't necessarily have to remember the specifics of it because nobody can. But know that we cover that topic and go back and look it up. And then, you know, certain key areas like how we deal with titles, capitalized before name, lowercase after name. Some of the main points on numbers, which I've tried to clarify in the most recent update. Some of our guidance on prefixes and suffixes, which I've also tried to clarify. Some of these things that you come up with in your daily writing, commit those to memory. It just saves you time from having to look it up all the time. But other than that, just know that it's there.
Is there a philosophy in the AP on the long-term benefits of learning the AP style?
So we believe that AP Style just in general makes you a more consistent and professional communicator. It is the industry standard, not just in journalism, but in PR and in much of government communications. A lot of blogging, people, there's different style books, Chicago Manual of Style, for instance, which is more widely used and is aimed at academic work. AP Style is intended for a general audience, so no matter what kind of writing and editing you do, AP Style is aimed at helping you write clearly and concisely for a general audience, okay, and is widely recognized by employers everywhere. Sometimes I use the example of Starbucks, and I don't want to equate journalism with coffee, but Starbucks in part is successful because of its consistency, so that you know that your grande soy latte that you get in State College is going to be the same largely as the one you get in Hong Kong or Chicago. There's a certain consistency, and from that you can build and elaborate, but that core, that basic fundamental remains the same. I might have diverged from what you were actually asking, but you
Just want to make sure. Are there any questions out in the audience here? Go ahead, please.
In the past, you were an AP editor, and I was wondering what it takes to be an editor for the AP.
Multitasking. We, back even in Minneapolis in those days, I think the term multitasking didn't exist then, and by the way, AP Style is no hyphen tasking, something I know. But we have had through the years a number of really, really good editors and writers come through the AP who are excellent, but they're not multitaskers, okay? And I can't stress enough, really, really good editors. But in the AP, we've been multitasking since before the term was invented. I mean, you're editing literally 3 or 4 or 5 stories at once in varying stages. You're talking with reporters. You might be writing your own story about something, or consulting with a colleague on a standards issue or a wording issue. So for AP in particular, I think we need to have just very, very strong basic skills. We're not in a position to be teaching someone basic grammar. And we've had applicants who kind of expect that, well, I'm a good reporter, so I don't have to write well. I think we need people who can both write and report well, and who can do it all at the same time. So it's no small thing.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Please have the Oxford comma.
Okay. Oh, I get to set the record straight on the Oxford comma. Yay! It would not be a style book session without the Oxford comma. Okay. I probably all of you are familiar with this. First off, our position on the Oxford comma, for one thing, long predates me, but I don't see a particular reason to change it. Secondly, it's widely misinterpreted, okay? I mean, we do use that final comma in most cases, except in very simple series, such as I'm sitting here with Walter and John and the other John or Nick or whatever his name is these days. John, Paul, George, and Rico, okay? You do not need that final comma to make the meaning clear. And that's in keeping with the AP's overall guidance that punctuation should be used only when necessary and otherwise it adds clutter. But most times, we use it for clarity, and we have examples in the book. Now, we get requests that say, well, since you use it most of the time anyway, why not add it for those simple series? Okay. Well, you want to, you can. Just know that you're not using AP style. Our position is, again, it's not necessary. It doesn't add clarity. There's no need for it. To that, I would add, if I were to remove, or if I were to add the Oxford comma in a simple series, half of the world would explode. Because there are those that feel very, very strongly about needing the Oxford comma and those that feel very, very strongly about not. And we do, Mr. Affleck, there it is. We hear the anti-Oxford comma.
Anti.
Yeah. So yeah, honestly, I've been tempted sometimes to go ahead and do it just to stop the grief, but there's not a good reason for it. And we do make changes in the style book, including some of what's been in there for a very long time. If I look at it and say, I cannot justify this, I don't know what my predecessors were thinking, or things have changed since then, and there is good reason to change it now. In the case of the Oxford comma, you 50% that want it, I'm sorry, it's not going to happen, because the other 50% would kill me, and I've got, frankly, other things to deal with right now. But thank you for asking.
Be alert that she was the one that cut the fashion and food section out of the style book a while back.
So I was talking earlier today about how I cut out the fashion, they're still online, the fashion and food chapters, then I found out that he had a whole course, right, on fashion writing.
I'm also former fashion feature editor,
But,
yeah. Okay.
but, okay, the flip side of that is then if I kept all of that, then you'd have a book that's, 900 pages and even more to memorize than you already have.
Any other questions? I have one side note I missed. Yes, please.
How did inclusivity play a role in your work when you first started in the journalism industry, and how has it has it been difficult to change at all?
So, bearing in mind that I first started in journalism, a couple centuries ago, at that time, so let's say late 70s, early 80s, it really wasn't talked about at all. It wasn't a topic. We discussed to varying degrees greater diversity in news staffs. I know in particular that was an emphasis with my own boss in Minneapolis and Detroit, with the purpose of having more diverse coverage, but that was from having more diverse perspectives on your own staff. We didn't talk so much about inclusivity and diversity as it related to the actual coverage that we were doing. Why? I don't know. It just was not on our minds. And I think there has been increasing attention to it, obviously, over the years, but it really had a big uptick after the murder of George Floyd and that racial reckoning. But I think the AP had been ahead of it for a while, but everyone would agree we weren't nearly where we wanted to be. And now, I can't say enough good things about our inclusion champions and the Slack channels that they have. And I don't know if you have another way of doing it within your own classes, but there are lively real-time discussions. There's any number. There's the Inclusion Champions channel, there's the Race and Ethnicity channel, there's individual channels set up to a given story. And people, any staff, or Inclusion Champions, but also any staffer around the globe will raise an issue about a wording. Hey, I looked at this story the other day, and what about this? Or what about this photo? It's not representative. And it really, really is great to see these voices of staff members having a real voice and influencing that coverage that I think in the past would not have happened. And it's not that we didn't want it to. There wasn't that forum for people to really be contributing, and there wasn't the really strong overt encouragement that people get involved throughout the staff in this kind of feedback and discussion.
Yes.
How does a college student get involved with the AP today?
Well, unfortunately, it's much harder now than it was back in the day when we had internships and summer jobs, what was called vacation relief. These days, honestly, there's so many fewer staff positions and openings. One way, however, is Report for America. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but AP has a core of Report for America staffers that help out, or that get hired as AP staffers on a temporary basis, and a number of them eventually segue into full-time positions. Because the staffs are so much smaller, we really, for the most part, need people with much more experience. So a college student, other than say something like helping out on election night, that's kind of a foot in the door, but it's not as much of a foot in the door as we used to be able to offer. But if you are at some, interested in the AP down the road, certainly pay attention to everything that we do, read AP stories, kind of become familiar with how we approach things. But again, it's much, much harder now than it used to be. And it was always a big challenge, but even more so now.
Yes, ma'am.
Obviously, the AP Stylebook has a lot of information in it already, but do you have any other suggestions for resources that journalists might go to on the topics that you spoke about today?
So actually, yes. Do you all use those who use it, the print book or Stylebook online? Either way, it doesn't matter. We have a couple of years ago I expanded the bibliography, which is, I forget where in the print book, but also just search Stylebook online for bibliography. And in that, I greatly expanded a lot of the resources that we use, not all of them, but for instance, in coverage of disabilities or gender or race. I listed some other style guides that we use. The Seattle Times has a terrific guide to inclusive storytelling, very, very encompassing, that I added a link to that. And then, obviously, you go to each of those, and they will take you to other sources. But yeah, check our bibliography, which is not all-inclusive by any stretch, but it's a good jumping-off point. Because And I did it because we wanted to give those resources. I mean, we think the style book is great, but it's not infallible and it's not the only source. So I really, really wanted to actively encourage people to use these other resources and to give that to them and say, don't, no, here's what we say, but if you want to dive deeper or get other views, go check out these other resources on it.
I think on that note, we'll wrap it up. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you, Ms. Froke.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.